She was young, 22 years old, a nursing student with a future so full of promise that those who knew her couldn't imagine anything less than success. Laken Riley had always been the kind of person people gravitated toward, hardworking, determined, full of life. The kind of person who would have made a difference in the world if only she had been given the chance. Her days were spent juggling the demands of nursing school, a path she had chosen not just as a career but as a calling. She wanted to help people, to heal them, to be the kind of nurse who made a difference in patients' lives. Those who studied alongside her described her as focused, dedicated, and compassionate. Someone who pushed through the long hours of studying not because she had to, but because she genuinely cared. Outside of her studies, Laken embraced the kind of simple joys that defined a young woman with a full life ahead of her. She spent time with friends, kept active, and enjoyed the little moments most people take for granted. She had routines, habits that shaped her days, gave her structure. Among them was her love of jogging. It was her way of clearing her mind, staying fit, and finding a moment of peace amidst the chaos of schoolwork. February in Augusta, Georgia, was still cold, but not cold enough to keep her from her routine. The mornings were crisp, the air sharp but invigorating. It was the kind of weather that made a run feel refreshing rather than exhausting. And so, as she had done many times before, Laken laced up her running shoes, tied her hair back, and stepped outside, unaware that this particular morning would be different. Unaware that she would never return. Her disappearance would send ripples through the community. At first, it was just an absence, an unanswered text, a missed call, the kind of thing that could be explained away with 100 different reasons. Maybe she got held up, maybe her phone died, maybe she lost track of time. But as the minutes turned into hours, the unease began to spread. People don't just vanish. Not without reason. Not without something or someone intervening. And so, a question began to form in the minds of those who loved her. A question that would soon grow into a nightmare. Where was Laken Riley? It started like any other morning, a quiet, ordinary day. There was nothing unusual about it. No warning signs, no sense of impending danger. Just another routine jog. Laken Riley stepped outside, the cold morning air filling her lungs as she began her run. The path she took was one she had traveled before, a familiar route, a safe one. The kind of place where people felt comfortable, where students walked to class, where runners found solace in the rhythmic pounding of their feet against the pavement. She ran past towering trees that lined the path, their branches bare in the late winter chill. The world around her was still waking up, occasional cars rolling past, the distant hum of conversations from campus. For most people, it was just another day. But for Laken, this day would not end the way it was supposed to. The messages sent to her phone would go unread, the texts left unanswered. Minutes passed, then an hour, then 2. Friends began to notice her absence. The kind of absence that didn't make sense. Laken was responsible, punctual, reliable. If she had plans, she stuck to them. If she said she would be somewhere, she was there. And yet, now, she was nowhere to be found. The first messages were casual. Hey, where are you? A simple question, one that should have been met with a quick response, but none came. Then came the calls, straight to voicemail. That was when the worry began to set in. At first, they tried to reason with themselves. Maybe she lost track of time. Maybe her phone had died. Maybe she had changed her route. But the longer the silence stretched, the harder it became to believe those explanations. By the afternoon, concern turned into action. A report was made, authorities were contacted, and soon the search began. No one knew it yet, but somewhere out there, Laken Riley was no longer running, no longer breathing, no longer just missing. She had already become something else, a name that would soon be spoken in hushed, devastated tones, a face that would be plastered across news screens and social media, a victim in a story that was only just beginning. And somewhere, the person responsible for her disappearance was still out there, unseen, unknown, waiting. The search for Laken Riley began with hope, a hope that she was simply lost, that there was an explanation, one that would make sense, one that wouldn't lead to the unthinkable. Friends, classmates, and even strangers joined in, calling out her name, checking familiar places, retracing the steps they believed she had taken that morning. But hope has a way of unraveling when the hours stretch too long. When the silence grows too deep, when the air begins to carry something else, something heavy, something ominous. By late afternoon, authorities expanded their search, scouring the wooded areas near the running path she was last seen on. They moved carefully, methodically, their eyes scanning every inch of the ground. And then one of them stopped. A body. Laken Riley was no longer missing. She was found. Lying there in the cold, her body showed clear signs of violence, evidence of a struggle, of suffering, of a final moment that no one should have to endure. The vibrant young woman who had stepped outside that morning full of life and purpose had been reduced to a crime scene. The news spread fast, first as whispers, then as headlines. The words were stark, unforgiving. Nursing student found dead. Authorities investigating suspicious death. The kind of headlines that send shivers down a community's spine. The kind that turn a local tragedy into a national outcry. Friends and family who had spent hours searching were now left in stunned silence, unable to process what had just been confirmed. The grief came in waves. First disbelief, then devastation, then anger. But as the town mourned, the investigators had no time to grieve. There was still one question that remained unanswered. Who did this? Because somewhere out there, a killer was walking free, and it was only a matter of time before they were found. The moment Laken Riley's body was found, everything changed. This was no longer a missing person case. It was a murder investigation. The air around the crime scene became tense, every officer moving with precision, aware that somewhere among them, in the shadows of this quiet town, a killer was still out there. The authorities wasted no time. Every inch of the area was combed for evidence. Footprints in the dirt, strands of hair, fibers from clothing, anything that could point to who had been there with her in those final, brutal moments. The forensic team worked fast, collecting samples, dusting for prints, preserving anything that could hold an answer. Meanwhile, detectives turned to the next step, the timeline. Laken had been seen just that morning, jogging along her usual path. Someone had to have noticed something, an unfamiliar face, an unusual vehicle, anything that stood out against the ordinary. They began knocking on doors, speaking to students, asking workers near the area if they had seen anything strange. The questions came fast. Did you see her running? Did you notice anyone following her? Did you hear anything unusual? For a while, there was nothing, just scattered observations, passing details that led nowhere. But then a piece of information. Someone had noticed something. A figure lurking near the trail. A man, one who didn't belong. His presence had been odd, unsettling, the kind of thing that sends an instinctive warning through a person's mind, even if they can't explain why. That lead pushed investigators towards surveillance footage. Cameras from nearby buildings, traffic lights, security posts. They combed through hours of footage looking for anything, any glimpse of Laken, any sign of someone following her. And then, they found him. A man, moving near the area. He wasn't just passing through. His path intersected with hers. His movements were deliberate. And when she disappeared, so did he. A suspect had emerged. Now, the only thing left to do was find him. Because if he had done this once, he could do it again. And they had no intention of letting that happen. The pieces were coming together. A shadowy figure captured on surveillance. A man who had no reason to be there. No connection to Laken, no innocent explanation for his presence near the crime scene. The more investigators uncovered, the clearer the picture became. His name was Jose Ibarra. They found him quickly. He hadn't fled the state, hadn't disappeared into the night like some criminals do. Maybe he thought he had done enough to cover his tracks. Maybe he thought no one would suspect him. But he was wrong. When law enforcement closed in, he didn't put up much of a fight. There was no dramatic chase, no last-minute attempt at escape, just cold reality as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. He was taken in for questioning, placed in a small room under the unrelenting gaze of detectives who had seen men like him before, killers who thought they could get away with it. At first, he said nothing, but the evidence spoke for him. Traces of Laken, DNA, marks that told a story of struggle, of fear, of violence. He had tried to erase what he had done, but science has a way of speaking for the dead. The officers weren't asking if he had done it. They knew. They were asking why. But there are some questions that don't have answers. or at least not ones that make sense to anyone except the monster who committed the crime. The arrest was announced, and with it, the floodgates opened. The news spread like wildfire. Laken Riley's killer had a name, a face, a past that no one could ignore. Because there was another detail about Jose Ibarra, one that turned this case from a horrific crime into a national controversy. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was an undocumented immigrant, a man who had crossed into the United States illegally, and now a young woman was dead because of it. The arrest wasn't just about justice for Laken anymore. It was about something much bigger, a battle over borders, over security, over who should be allowed to walk freely in a country where one man's presence had led to an innocent woman's murder. The case was no longer just about what had happened. It was about how it had been allowed to happen in the first place. The moment Jose Ibarra's immigration status was revealed, Laken Riley's murder became more than just a tragic crime. It became a symbol, a flashpoint in a national debate that had been raging for years. People weren't just mourning Laken anymore. They were angry, furious, demanding answers. How had he entered the country? How had he remained here? Could this have been prevented? The facts painted a troubling picture. Ibarra had crossed into the United States illegally. He wasn't just an undocumented immigrant. He was someone who should have never been in Georgia, never been anywhere near Laken Riley. Yet there he was, walking freely. And now Laken was gone. Politicians wasted no time. Some pointed to the case as proof of a broken immigration system, one that allowed criminals to slip through unnoticed, to build new lives where they didn't belong, to commit unspeakable acts with no accountability. Others pushed back, arguing that crime existed everywhere, that one man's actions shouldn't be used to paint an entire group. But for those who knew Laken, this wasn't about politics. It wasn't about policies, debates, or agendas. It was about a life that had been stolen. A young woman with dreams of helping others, whose future had been ripped away by someone who should have never been near her in the first place. Her name became a rallying cry. Protests erupted, some demanding stricter border security, others calling for justice not just for Laken, but for every victim of crimes committed by undocumented immigrants. News anchors debated the case nightly. Social media exploded with outrage. Politicians used her name in speeches, in interviews, in campaign slogans. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had something to say. But through all the noise, one fact remained. Laken Riley was gone, and no policy, no debate, no fiery speech could ever bring her back. What remained now was the pursuit of justice, the courtroom battle that would decide the fate of the man who had taken her life. Jose Ibarra had been arrested. Now he would face trial, and the world would be watching. The courtroom was silent, heavy with anticipation. The air was thick, not just with grief, but with something else. A demand, a need for justice. Jose Ibarra sat at the defense table, expression unreadable. He had been stripped of whatever freedom he once had, now clad in the dull, lifeless colors of a prison uniform. His hands rested on the table, cuffed, as if the metal links could somehow contain the horror of what he had done. Across from him, Laken Riley's family sat in quiet agony. Her mother, her father, her loved ones, faces pale, eyes darkened by sleepless nights and endless grief. They had come not just to witness, but to make sure her name was not forgotten, to make sure that the man who had stolen her life would never walk free again. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted a clear picture, one built on cold, undeniable facts. Laken Riley had gone out for a morning run, something she had done countless times before. She had no reason to fear for her safety, no reason to suspect that she was being watched, followed, hunted. But Jose Ibarra had been there, waiting. He had no connection to Laken, no reason to cross paths with her, except for one: violence. They detailed what the evidence had already confirmed: the struggle, the fear she must have felt in those final moments, the injuries that left no doubt that this had not been quick nor painless. She had fought, she had tried to survive, but she had lost. The defense tried to push back. They argued intent, circumstances. They hinted at possible explanations, grasping at anything that could soften the image of the man sitting in front of them. But there was nothing to soften. The jury listened, faces unreadable. They were ordinary people, men and women, who had been chosen to sit in judgment of a crime that had shattered a community. They had been warned not to let emotion cloud their judgment. But how could they not? How could they listen to what had happened and not feel the weight of it pressing down on them? The trial stretched on, but the outcome felt inevitable. The evidence was overwhelming. The truth, undeniable. When the prosecution rested their case, the room seemed to hold its breath. The final chapter of this tragedy was approaching. And soon, the man who had stolen Laken Riley's future would hear the words that would decide his own. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, every hallway crowded with people waiting, watching, holding their breath. Reporters stood outside, cameras ready, microphones poised. Across the country, the nation was watching. And at the center of it all, a grieving family sat in silence, hands clenched together, waiting for the only words that mattered. Jose Ibarra sat motionless. His face betrayed nothing. No remorse, no fear. Just the same empty stare he had carried throughout the trial. As if the weight of what he had done had never touched him. As if he had already resigned himself to whatever was coming. The jury had been gone for hours, but now they were back. 12 men and women, their faces unreadable, their verdict sealed in an envelope that would decide his fate. The judge entered. The room fell into absolute silence. A clerk stood, holding the paper in shaking hands. In the case of the state versus Jose Ibarra, a pause. We, the jury, find the defendant. It felt like time itself had stopped. Guilty. The word rang through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Guilty of murder. Guilty of taking Laken Riley's life. Guilty of an act so senseless, so cruel, that no punishment could ever truly be enough. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Laken's mother clutched her chest, tears streaming down her face. Her father nodded slowly, as if he had known this was coming but needed to hear it said aloud to believe it. The judge's voice followed soon after. Strong, unwavering. Jose Ibarra, you are sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No second chances, no appeals that could bring him back into the world, no possibility of freedom. For Laken's family, it was justice. Not closure. There could never be closure, but justice. For Jose Ibarra, it was the end. The gavel slammed down, it was over. But outside the courthouse, the world was still watching. The outrage, the grief, the questions, they weren't over. Because long after the sentence was handed down, one question would remain. How had this happened in the first place? The trial was over. The sentence had been handed down. But for Laken Riley's family, for her friends, for the community that had mourned her, there was no sense of victory. Justice had been served, but it hadn't changed the fact that she was gone. The world moved on. The news cycle shifted. The headlines faded. But for those who loved her, time did not heal. It only stretched endlessly, a reminder of everything she should have been. Her parents spoke publicly for the first time. Their voices steady but broken. They didn't talk about politics or controversy. They spoke about their daughter. The bright, determined young woman who had worked so hard, who had dreamed of becoming a nurse, of helping others. A life that had been stolen in the most violent way possible. Her friends still walked the campus, passing the places she once stood. Her absence was a hole that could never be filled. A memorial was built near the trail where she had taken her final steps, a plaque with her name, a reminder that she had been here, that she had mattered, that she had been loved. But outside of Augusta, her story had become something else. Her name was now a rallying cry. Some shouted it in anger, demanding change, pointing to her death as proof of a system that had failed. Others mourned quietly, leaving flowers and notes at her memorial, refusing to let her be reduced to a political talking point. Laken Riley was more than a victim, more than a headline. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman who had walked into the world one morning, never knowing she wouldn't return. Her murderer would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But for those who loved her, the sentence meant nothing, because no matter how many years passed, the question would always remain, why her, and why did it have to happen at all? Time moved forward, as it always does. Seasons changed. The world kept spinning. But for those who had known Laken Riley, life would never be the same. Her parents still visited her grave, tracing their fingers over the letters of her name, whispering words she could no longer hear. Her friends still spoke about her, sharing stories of her kindness, her laughter, the way she had made even the hardest days feel lighter. But outside their circle of grief, her name had taken on a different weight. It had become a warning, a reminder of what happens when evil is allowed to walk freely among the innocent. A symbol of a failure that had cost a young woman her life. People still asked why. Why had this happened? Why had she been taken? Why had the system allowed her murderer to be here in the first place? There were no answers that could bring her back. No justice that could ever feel like enough. But there was one thing that could be done. We could remember, not just the way she died, but the way she lived. Laken Riley was more than a victim, more than a case number, more than a political debate. She was a person, a daughter, a friend, a young woman who should have had decades of life ahead of her. And now, her story belongs to all of us. A story that must be told, a name that must not be forgotten. If you believe that stories like this matter, if you believe that justice should not just be served, but remembered, then subscribe, because the world needs to hear the truth. And the truth must never be silenced.